Right, we've looked at drawing buildings in perspective when they're on flat ground, but how do you deal with buildings like this that run up a steep hill? In this case, this is a photograph of a very attractive and paintable little fishing village called Staithes in North Yorkshire, and it was for a while the home of Captain Cook, the famous explorer of the 18th century. Now, in this case, what I've done here is to put an eye line, or an imaginary eye line, across the middle of the picture here. Now, first of all, why have I decided it's at that particular point? It's because the perspective lines, and you can get a clue about the perspective lines from these mortar courses in this building here. This is where the mortar courses are at their straightest, and that black part of this building here is also pretty straight. So that's just about where the eye line would be, because when you draw an eye line, or you gauge where an eye line is, it doesn't matter whether it's up here or down there, but it is always horizontal. It's never like that or like that. So the first point that we reach where the eye line is horizontal is this, and we've used these mortar courses to help us out. Now, I've also added a few more lines of perspective lines here, just following the line of the bottom or the tops of some of the windows and doors, and in this case the roof line, and they all gradually merge towards an imaginary vanishing point somewhere about here, just off the photograph. But you can see how the theory that we looked at in drawing buildings in perspective in the previous lesson actually holds up when you put them on top of a photograph, because you can see as these perspective lines get further up the building, they get steeper and steeper and steeper because you're looking higher. Now, as these buildings get further up the hill, then those perspective lines are going to get steeper again. Okay, we're back to the photograph for a moment with a fresh sheet of acetate. Now this time what I'm going to do is to draw a basic outline, the shell if you like, of each building. That one's a little bit higher because the roof line is stepped up. That one is more pronounced. Now, I've done the bases of these buildings flat because that's how they would be inside the buildings. The floorboards would be flat and level, because if the floorboards were nailed down at the same angle as the street falls away, everybody would go in through the front door and they'd be lurching to the right and constantly banging against the bottom wall of their house because the floorboards were sloped. Right, now this is what a set of 4 houses like this picture would look like. Let's put a door in the building like that. Now the top of the doorway starts going upwards in accordance with the normal rules of perspective. Let's do the next house, and that's got a door, and the next house, which is a little bit higher still, like that. If it has a couple of windows up here, this perspective is a bit steeper again because it's near the roof line. Remember what we said, as we get higher then the perspective lines get steeper. You can see the top of the roof is a slightly steeper angle again. Now the next thing I'm going to do is put the line of the pavement next to those houses, and you can see now if we add a little extended bit there, or in these cases rub out the bits that stick onto the pavement like that, then you can see how very simply and very easily we've created that impression of the street going upwards. Okay, I've added a few details and shadows to this little row of houses, and normally I wouldn't bother doing that if I was going to paint it, because obviously I'd be using shadow colour instead of pencil for these areas here, but it really helps, I think, to show more clearly how the perspective lines and the angles work when you can define one area against another. Now here we can see the street going up the hill. Now from about this position here, I've taken a photograph looking down the hill like that. You can see this cottage is this one here, this cottage is here, and this blue building or blue painted building is this one here. First of all, I've drawn my eye line across here, and you can see, because I'm very much higher up the hill than some of these houses, my eye line is actually at the top of the roof of this little cottage, and it's nearly at the top of this much taller house here. But you can also see that although this road is leading very steeply downhill, when I actually sketch in the line of the street itself down there like that, you can see that the lines actually go quite steeply upwards. So it's something you need to get your head around a little bit. And on these perspective tutorials, you may need to look at the particular lessons 2 or 3 times before you get your head around it. But I promise you, once the penny does drop, you'll find it quite simple and quite straightforward. And in fact, you'll start drawing these buildings in the correct perspective quite instinctively once you've had a little bit of practice. And one of the best ways I find to practice drawing perspective is any bit of scrap paper when you've got 2 minutes of your time, just scribbling without any pressure about getting anything right, and you'll find that in no time at all you'll get the perspective of these buildings just right. I spent many years in what in Britain we call local government, or in other parts of the world you probably call City Hall, and I spent my time in interminably boring meetings for all sorts of different reasons. Each meeting generally having a whole wad of papers of reports and agendas and so on. I did find that the white parts of the paper, or the backs if they hadn't been printed on, were ideal for just playing around with little sketches like that and just getting perspective correct in all sorts of different ways. But apart from passing the time in an otherwise mind-numbing way, it also taught me an awful lot about painting and drawing that I was able to put to good use when I got home. See, I'm just doing that while I'm talking quite instinctively. It's not because I'm clever, it's because I've practiced a lot at all these meetings. Right, now for the purposes of this little demonstration, I'm going to assume that I'm actually standing further up the hill here, and that my eye line is going to be level with the top of this roof. So what I've done here is drawn an eye line, and I've put a vanishing point here and drawn some perspective lines so I can take the windows and doors in this first building. Now I'm going to assume that the end of the building is there. In fact, I'll just draw in another perspective line like that. Incidentally, you must keep your vertical lines vertical. Unless the building is actually keeling over and about to collapse, these lines must always be vertical, as must the lines for your doorways and windows. Okay, we've got the first building there. The next building we'll have a little bit lower, and we'll use this line here. Now you can see I've made that baseline as a step there. I haven't drawn anything sloping. I've made that as a step. Right, I'm just rubbing most of the perspective lines out. I don't want to lose them completely because I need to use them for the doors and windows. But we'll just keep this fairly simple. I won't put too many doors and windows in. Now when we were looking up the hill, if you remember, the perspective lines got steeper the higher up the building we were looking at, so the roof line and the roof was the steepest angle of perspective. Now looking down the hill, the opposite happens, where the flattest part of the perspective is at the roof level, but the steepest part is when we come to draw in the door like that, or indeed any windows. As we get up towards the top of the roof, the perspective flattens out quite considerably. Right, for clarity's sake, I've added a little bit of shading to the end of the terrace here, and I've also put a little bit of shading in the recessed areas of the doors and windows for the same reason we did here, except this time we've got the sun coming from the top right. What you can also see is that I've suggested two ways of the chimneys being built. On this side, the chimney is suggested as coming through just one side of the roof because the end of it ends where it meets the apex of the roof. On this chimney here, I've taken the chimney stack across and along the apex of the roof slightly, suggesting that it sits on either side of the roof. Very, very simple to do. And again, I put a little bit of shading on it to show how it works. And in fact, if you wanted to do it completely accurately, you add a little bit of shadow like that on the roof to pick up the shadow from the chimney, the cast shadow on the roof itself. Now, as far as getting the street coming uphill, you can see already we've got a fairly good basis of the step up of these buildings looking from above. But if we draw a line that again comes up here on an angle and then, shall we say, goes like that, and again we're going to need to rub out just the bottom corners of the steps that we've made. And then what I'm also going to have to do for that one there is to extend it downwards. Right, now you can see how I've extended the doorways downwards to the pavement there and extended the buildings at the end building there, and also run the pavement starting to curl back downwards. In other words, it's actually drawn up the paper to start with, but now by curving it downwards you can really get a hint that the street drops even steeper at this point if you want. And then to pick up the other point where we had the other side of the street. Right, now you can see I've added a pavement in here and I've just done a hint of it so it looks like it's about to go down at an even steeper level. Right, I've made one or two little adjustments and amendments where I've actually rubbed out some of my drawing of the windows and doors that hadn't quite conformed with the correct perspective, or even though it was the correct perspective, for whatever reason it just didn't look right. And as I've said earlier, whatever looks right in art invariably is right. Now, one message I want to get very clearly here is that having rubbed out all these construction lines and swapped things around, I wouldn't be happy if that drawing was now on my watercolour paper. It's a good idea, at least at the outset, to draw your drawing on something other than your watercolour paper, and then a little later on in this DVD we'll have a look at a couple of ways that we can very easily transfer that image cleanly and tidily onto your watercolour paper so it takes the paint in the way it should.